Hello everybody. Last week we had a look at the alternative history YouTuber called Whatifalthist, and about 100% of my comments asked me to make a similar video on Monsieur Z, or Mr. Z as he calls himself. He likewise makes alternative history videos and then occasionally standalone videos about topics like a demographic crisis is inevitable and why Woodrow Wilson did nothing wrong. A lot like Whatifalthist, he describes himself as a historian, which, let me remind you, historians are educated to look at and describe history. The tools they use for that are not applicable to current day society and politics. That is a job for the sociologists. Though, to his credit, he makes way fewer bullshit extrapolations than Whatifalthist does. Again, for those inevitable few among you who are new, I'm a leftist with an education in political science. This may subconsciously influence my arguments and which parts of this video I reply to. I am telling you this now to say that I'm aware of my biases and I will try to work around them. Something that Mr. Z clearly never did. He does not proclaim his ideology at all in any of the videos I've seen. You may assume that this means that he's politically neutral and just brings us the harsh reality and truth, as his channel description puts it. But that's not true, as we will see throughout the video. Full disclosure, I did not watch all of their videos. They have 300 videos and I only had about 20 hours for research. So I watched a bunch which were new, popular, or just sounded interesting to me. In this video, I will not reply to the videos one by one. Instead, we will look at those videos and what about them is interesting. In effect, I'm ignoring the parts I think are alright. And just to give him credit, his videos are good about 80% of the time. They do their research well, and objective videos like Will We See World War III are great. The interesting and dangerous parts of the channel is when he moves on from the facts and offers his own interpretations of the modern or past world. This is because when interpreting current day politics, it's almost impossible not to accidentally show your beliefs. And remember, they have a video defending Woodrow Wilson, so they have some strong and radical political opinions. Not to say that being radical is inherently wrong. I am radical too, but I think being radical with rightist ideas is almost all the time wrong. This is because I personally am a utilitarian. I want to bring the most good to the most people, and I don't think that promoting or defending racist things in history will achieve that. But racial equality and freedom may do that. Hence why I'm a leftist, not a rightist. If you want to learn more about leftism, why don't you check out my channel? I have a whole series explaining different ideologies or different historical events from the view of a leftist. And I make more like that every single week, so why not subscribe? All that being said, time to look at the videos I watched. For this section, I'm not yet getting into the instances of Mr. Z being casually or openly racist or defending racism. That's the next section. This one is just about the weird things that stood out to me. The first video I watched was about what if D-Day failed. They correctly point out that the Soviets asked for D-Day to take pressure off the Eastern Front, and that's all the mention the Soviets get. The entire video is focused on what America and Britain would do differently. Which, by the way, is Britain using anthrax in Berlin and America invading Italy and southern France. They also say that Japan did not surrender because the Soviets declared war on them, but purely because of American action like the nuclear weapons and firebombs. This is part of a huge trend among Western historians, and that trend is to downplay the actions of the heroes of the Red Army in World War II. He almost only talks about what Britain and America would do differently, and the Soviets are not seen as American allies but as rivals. In effect, he's using the Cold War way of thinking to analyze the Second World War. And he's ignoring the fact that most of the fighting of the war, along with most territory taken, was by the USSR. Frankly, even without D-Day, the USSR would have outnumbered the Wehrmacht by a factor of 3 in 1944. Though, of course, while more realistic, the idea that the war would have ended the exact same way would make for a worse alt-hist video on his end. He also seemed to have strange ideas about colonialism. In his video on the Third World War, he says that the USA pressured France and England to decolonize, and that this was a bad thing because after gaining independence, some of the African nations became dictatorships, or way worse, friends of the Soviet Union. I will leave you to figure out what that implies. No, I won't. It implies that colonialism is better than countries choosing a different way from the one you like. You know, better not have democracy because they may choose to be communists. That whole video is structured weird. It says it's about World War III, but just goes over every conflict zone and explains why that conflict won't cause a Third World War. I totally agree that right now the potential for a world war is not there. And he even correctly predicts that Russia could invade Ukraine and nobody would care. He also says America is in decline, which is a theme with the right-ish alt-history YouTubers. Interestingly, he mentions in several videos that there's a possibility that the UK, Canada, Australia and New Zealand form a united country called Kansyuk, which I don't even know how to comment on that. I talked to Canadians and Australians and they all agree that the only ones who would want that unification to happen are old conservative British people. In his video on understanding fascism, Mr. Z says that fascism is extremist democracy and explains how fascist Native Americans would push out the white people. Why does he make up an imaginary fascist state to explain it? Because being honest and naming real examples of fascism would require him to defend Hitler and Mussolini. Then he says that in democracy you never have everyone be happy, so you may as well not even try, and he calls fascism the dark side of the force. Also, his video on fascism does not once mention how fascism inevitably leads to race wars and genocide. Now that I spent a bit talking about the things he says which are not necessarily racist, let's look at the suspect things. Just note that only because I find these things racist doesn't mean that they're racist according to your value system. We all define a term differently, so do your own thinking about whether I'm judging them correctly. We can compare notes in the comments if you like. The first suspect video I saw was titled "What if America was never colonized?" He starts off strong by saying that the natives of the American continents were mostly primitive farmers and hunters. He later says that the only reason American tribes still exist now is because they get technology from Europeans, like guns and tuberculosis. This is a classical case of chauvinism, which is when you consider your group and its way of life and organization of society superior to all others. We also see this because he does not even attempt to understand the ways many tribes lived, traded and organized themselves. The only ones he recognizes are the Aztecs, the Inca and the Maya. And that's just because they had civilizations that are similar to the Western ones we know. They had farmers and stone houses, they had kings and nobles and so on. And we can immediately see that Mr. Z considers that 100% superior to other civilizations in every way. He even talks about how the oral history of the tribes was useless. He even says that if the Inca would not conquer the rest of the tribes, American natives would continue their primitive lives forever. The fact that our civilized society almost destroyed itself in nuclear war and is currently failing to stop itself from poisoning the air and water and ground permanently seems not to matter. They were different, so they're primitive, and that is bad. He also says that the Haudenosaunee could have been a huge empire, which is like saying the EU will conquer Russia. That is not how the Confederation works. In his video about the coming demographic collapse, he makes interesting assertions. Basically, his observation is that birth rates all across the world, yes, the world, not just the West, he's not a reactionary, are falling. And because of this, labor will be more expensive and prices may increase, which is a fair statement, I'd say. But he just has to make it weird. He explains how countries like Germany let in too many immigrants to replace people who retire. And then explains how these immigrants are just putting on strains on the state finances because They would rather receive unemployment benefits than do bad jobs. Classical immigrant lazy no work argument here. Then he says, as prices increase and resources become scarce, there will be, just take a guess, what will happen when things get expensive? Exactly, racial conflict between the immigrants and citizens. If your answer was communist revolution, then you're based and bread-pilled, but Mr. Z clearly thinks that crisis will turn us all into ethno-nationalists. Then he predicts that nations with many designated racial groups will collapse and only ones with homogeneous populations will survive. The term homogeneous seems to be his favorite word. He uses it a lot. He also talks about iPhones destroying the youth and testosterone decreasing among men, which is apparently related to the demographic collapse. In his video on the inevitable breakup of Indonesia, he makes almost the same argument as we saw from Whatifalthist last week. And that's the idea that Indonesia has too many cultures living together. He mentions how the borders make no sense because of the Dutch, and he mentions how there are 800 languages. He says that modern Indonesian identity is fabricated, which somehow makes it false, and then he even says that really Indonesia is just an empire from the people of Java because they are the largest minority. Clearly he assumes that many racial or linguistic groups cannot coexist in one state. He even says Indonesia only existed until now because it had a dictatorship, and that if people had their way within democracy, it would collapse instantly. Last one we're going to look at is concerned with South Africa, and I really have to give him credit. He talked about economic inequality and issues at the very first, and only brought up the racist arguments later. He starts off talking about unemployment numbers and poverty, and then he says South Africa is only poor because the big dumb government tries to make people equal instead of letting the free market decide who is best for what job. He adds that only a small percentage of South Africans do their jobs well. Which percentage that is left unspoken. But after he's done blaming the South African attempt to reduce inequality, he talks about how South Africa is called the rainbow state for having so many different groups living there. He wastes no time to point out, and I quote, a homogeneous population is non-existent. And he says that eventually, because the government is so bad, South Africa will go the way of Yugoslavia. Which I guess means it will collapse into many nation states that engage in war and genocide. He is the one to use the Yugoslavia comparison, not me. Let us finally come to possibly the worst video they ever made. The one titled Woodrow Wilson Did Nothing Wrong. You can imagine this section like a small response video hidden after 13 minutes of talking about other things. In case you don't know, Woodrow Wilson was the President of the United States between 1912 and 1920. He was a Democrat, which meant the opposite of what it means now. He was one of the rightist conservatives elected by the Confederate types. He was the first Democratic president since the American Civil War. The only reason he won was because the Republicans split the vote between their candidate and Theodore Roosevelt, who was president before Wilson and did many good things. If you remember, Whatifalthist made a whole video on what if Roosevelt won that election. And while I criticize that, I do very much agree with the idea that Roosevelt would have been a way better president. But why? What did Woodrow Wilson do? Well, let's take a look at that. As someone who grew up in the American South after the Civil War, he was, well, racist. Despite that, he did good things. He worked on individual rights for white people, he established compensation for those hurt on the jobs, and worked against child labor. He also engaged in trust busting and established the American Central Bank, known as the Federal Reserve. And despite what libertarians will tell you, the Fed is a necessary institution in a capitalist economy with private banks. It's not run by some secret conspiracy group bullshit. But that's about it when it comes to good things he did. Since he was a Southerner, he just could not help himself but segregate the federal government. This is significant because most of the economy was segregated since before the Civil War. So the federal government was the only place people of color were guaranteed to be treated like white people and where they could actually rise the ranks and get promotions. When black civic leaders approached Wilson and asked him to reconsider their resegregation, he straight up told them that segregation is a benefit for the people and that they should see it. He fucked over people of color and told them to thank him for it. Do you know the KKK? The very racist people in white hoods that murder innocent people because of their race? Well, they started after the Civil War. An action by the federal government almost immediately destroyed it. It was basically over. But then many years later there was a film made called Birth of a Nation, which was basically KKK propaganda. Not only did Wilson do nothing against the reforming of the KKK, he also screened that very racist movie in the White House. Wilson is the reason there's a KKK nowadays, because he let it happen. He was a fan of the South after all. While Wilson pretended not to want to join World War I, he did invade Haiti and Mexico, among others. Eventually he joined World War I, and this is really when he went off the rails. He established the Espionage and Sedition Act, which prevented people from speaking out against the draft, and was basically a blanket reason to arrest all socialists, anarchists, ethnic Germans, and whoever else Woodrow didn't like. He also started to censor mail and newspapers. As you can tell, this sounds like the start of a video on an African dictatorship. Wilson just completely ignored the entire constitution out of convenience. All of the values America tells itself it holds were destroyed by him. Strangely, after World War I was over, Wilson managed to get the League of Nations established, and then failed to get a Congress to sign off on it, so the country did not even join the alliance Wilson had helped found. Eventually Wilson got a stroke and his wife became de facto ruler of the United States. There is an alternative universe where he didn't get a stroke and became an authoritarian president that plunged the US into a dictatorship. So, how does Mr. Z defend all that? Sure, Wilson did many good things, but also some really awful things. Can you really name a video Woodrow Wilson did nothing wrong? Well, no, but he did. Mr. Z starts off saying that Wilson is good. As evidence, he cites the trust busting and establishment of the Fed, which I agree is important in a capitalist economy. Then Mr. Z says that the Espionage and Sedition Act was justified because of all the violent anarchists and immigrants around. Great way to blame the immigrants for having their own rights taken away. He says the act was needed since the anarchists assassinated the former president. But you didn't need to censor the entire country's mail to do that. Planning to assassinate the president was already illegal. Censoring everyone's mail was not needed to stop anarchist revolution. Revolution was already not allowed. Mr. Z continues to say that Woodrow Wilson's segregation of the American government was just a product of its time, at which point I would like to remind you that the title says Wilson did nothing wrong, which implies that segregation was not wrong. Because even if it was a product of its time, Mr. Z could still say that it was bad and that he disagrees with it. He could say that it was wrong and was a product of its time. But if you allow that nuance, I guess you can't make an awful clickbait title. The only way to say he did nothing wrong is if you agree with the segregation part. Secondly, no it wasn't. American presidents had kept the government desegregated since the Civil War many years before. President after president fought segregation. Wilson was the only one to actively introduce it. It's not a product of its time if everyone else at the time thought it was awful. And you won't believe how Mr. Z justifies Wilson's promotion of the racist film and inaction against the second wave of the KKK. Exactly, he says it's a product of the time, which, no, it's not. Again, the presidents before him had actively fought the KKK. Wilson was the first one to allow it to come back. Everyone else at the time opposed it. So you can't say it's a product of its time. So yeah, that one video specifically is awful and wrong, and the other videos I looked at show a lot about how Mr. Z sees the world. He is a Western historian and appropriately is a Western chauvinist who thinks that contemporary society is the peak of humanity, while also openly saying that multi-ethnic societies are doomed to fail. He defended fascism by completely omitting the fascist tendency to genocide. I was told he defended eugenics on Twitter, but his account was deleted, so take that with a grain of salt. But hey, we have this here, which is him defending sexism and segregation, saying that women and minorities were happier without rights, which I doubt he actually thought about, because he's a cishet guy who got all of his rights on a silver platter and has never experienced even the slightest real-world discrimination. In the end, he's yet another part of the far-right pipeline, a lot like Whatifalthist. He, intentionally or not, sends people on a path to the far right which ends somewhere around the alt-right. He is taking people curious about history and turning them into tools that can be used by alt-right leaders to, well, from anything to riots to genocide. At least I myself only lead people to set gas stations on fire. That's why the left is better. Thank you very much for watching to the end, it means a lot. Much like Whatifalthist, Mr. Z has videos that would deserve whole debunkings on their own. But I think I will take a bit of a break from watching far-right content now, especially since I'm having COVID symptoms as I write, read and edit this. Which makes sense considering my mother also has COVID right now. Anyways, you can support me by doing simple things like leaving a like or sharing this video with your crazy friend who liked Mr. Z. Subscribing would of course be better, and the ultimate form of support is using the super thanks button or becoming a Patreon. If you're a patron, you can join the Discord server or even have your name read out a bit like this. Special thanks to Autumn Keasley, Theon Hartley, Adam Bow, Eric Bates, V, Xander Corbett, Tusnek, Attila Nemitz, Bottom Bitch Lena, Carissa, Daniel Heimer, Dominic Cusanelli, Emily Margot Klassen, Evie Wren, Herdina, Ian Snyder, Kevin Sanders, Clastrip, Lazy Panda 234, Liam S, Nane Pema, Ramin Deville, Red Shock Trooper, Sarah, Sean Murphy, Stefan Chef, V and Gillian Jr. and nobody, because Trey unsupported.